Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
This is Lean Into Lonely. My name is Kate Milliken, and in 2006, I was diagnosed with MS. I was 35, single, and I couldn't walk, and I'll never forget how lonely I felt as I came to terms with my new normal. Upon further reflection, I realized my whole life had been dotted with lonely moments. I was lonely when my brother got invited to a party and I didn't. I was lonely when I didn't get into my first choice college. I was really lonely when I got ditched at the altar 2 months before my wedding. And as a startup entrepreneur, now working to eliminate the problem of loneliness in chronic illness, I realized I'm still lonely. Instead of hiding from these moments, I'm taking the opposite approach. And this podcast blows open moments like these from people like you. This is Lean Into Lonely. After getting diagnosed in 2006, a friend set me up with a guy named David Kelleher. This was somebody who lived in Oregon, who had been an Army Ranger, who did a lot of work with the MS Society, and who lived with MS himself. And I'll never forget connecting with him on the phone because he was so resilient in the face of his MS. And he served to be an incredible foothold for me in terms of my healing. David invited me to take part in a half Ironman triathlon as the swimming leg. So I went and got to meet a bunch of his friends, including his girlfriend at the time named Kysa. She and David got married and they now share 6 children. She's also the author of the No Bullshit Guide to Parenting, which is an incredible book about giving accountability back to your kids. I love it. I'm excited to talk to Kysa about what it's like to be a spouse of someone living with MS. So Kysa, I feel like a great place to start this conversation is to try to introduce David, because I think people living with MS, each one of them is individual, but David specifically is a character. So tell me a little bit about him, how you met, and when you discovered he had MS.
I was interviewing for a job with his company, and he told me, like you said, he's an interesting character. He told me at that, like 5 minutes into the interview, that I was not the caliber of employee that he was looking for. I left that lunch with no job, but I already had a job, so I was okay there. But I really liked this guy, and I wanted to go on a date with him. So I called him up, and I asked him out, and we went out, and on our first date, I discovered he had MS, and I discovered he had a son, and I was hooked.
Do you remember how he told you that he had MS?
Well, it's funny. He just said, yeah, and I have this disease. I have MS. Well, you might hear about a disease. Oh, somebody has this. When you hear cancer, you get scared. MS, you're kind of like, oh, I'm sorry you have that. Like it's an allergy. I just didn't know. It wasn't part of my world. So I just said, oh, I'm sorry you have that. And we moved on. I sort of let it go.
I think it's fair to state that David, in who he is sort of a very low-key badass. So, the way that we met, as I said in the intro, is that we were doing this triathlon, and I did one leg of this half Ironman triathlon, and like David went on to bike and do the run. He's a little bit unconventional in the sense of somebody living with MS. He struck me as a very strong person. The other thing I think is worth noting is that the MS does affect him. So how does that manifest, and what do you see?
First of all, I'll say I haven't seen a lot. But when he was first diagnosed, as most people, you find out that you have MS because you have an exacerbation. And I wasn't part of his life back then. He was blind in one eye, and I think one went off to the right, and full numbness in one side of his body and using a cane. But today, he has this weird sensation that goes like down his back and through his arms. It's not painful. It's just weird. And it's weird to the sense that, I sent him to the ER once because I was like, chest pain, 45 years old, get out of here. Like, right, we're calling 911. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And all we got diagnosed was a little bit of elevated blood pressure. And so there's nothing wrong with him aside from MS. And they don't even know if this is MS related because it's such that mystery, funky disease. So to him, it's nerve-wracking, absolutely nerve-wracking. I can see it sometimes. He'll do this like weird flex thing with his shoulders, not like muscle man flex, but like, I don't know, rotate them back. And then I know it's bugging him, but he's sort of accepted it. And then I don't know if you have this issue, Kate, when he takes we've changed our vocabulary from drugs to medicine because we have 6 children. We figure we shouldn't use the word drugs around our house. We use the word. He takes his medicine on Saturday nights. He hates Sundays because he feels terrible.
It's Avonex, right? That he's on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He feels like he has the flu. And, with 6 kids, I used to be kinder. And like when we had like 2 and 3 kids and I'd let him sleep in and relax. And now I'm like, buddy, you were in the Army, like rally, we got to go. Everybody's up. It's time for breakfast. So, kind of like you and I deal with our monthly cycle and we rally and we don't curl up in bed. I'm kind of like, you got to get up and go and help me. I can't do this myself. Right. So that, and he, like Sunday was a tough day for him. And, if it's super duper tough, then I'm a little bit nicer.
You guys can effectively communicate on some level in terms of recognizing when it's bad.
Yeah. And he needs to communicate to me, right? I mean,
how does he do on that?
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
I know for me with MS that actually I devised a number system with my husband because you don't really want to talk about it, but you kind of I want him to know that things aren't totally right. So I might say I'm having an MS moment and he'll say, what's the number? And if it's 3 or 4, he won't even blink. If I say, 7, he gets wary. And if I say 8 or 9, he like pulls out a machete and cancels all my plans and brings in neighbors to help and really supports me. So I think that whole idea of trying to communicate, different gradients of bad, which I think is so interesting as you live with someone with MS, of starting to understand those different levels of not feeling well.
And it's interesting, the fear of how will Sunday go? Or when your husband hears 6, are we going to go to a 7? Do you know what I mean? Or is this going to stay? Like, is this going to happen on this crappy feeling? Is this going to be on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday? Like, when's it going to end? Do you know what I mean? Like that feeling that your husband and I feel, like that is sort of similar. Well, I shouldn't say that it's similar to like David's unknown MS weird thing that he has in his back. But in our little world, the unknown is
enormous,
nerve-wracking at times, especially for me. Like I'm a stay-at-home mom. Like I'm not a contributor to the bottom line. Like, I mean, here's the dirty nitty gritty. My husband in a wheelchair is really scary, or not being able to speak, like, financially, that's a scary spot for us. Life insurance wise, we could be fine, but I don't want to lose my husband. And I actually don't have that conversation with him very often because I don't want him to feel bad.
Right.
But then at the same time, when I was trading and on the trading floor, there were all these quiet moments and we'd have all these crazy conversations and everyone was like, well, so when is David, not everyone, but one guy in particular, were talking about it. And he's like, when's David going to be in a wheelchair? And I said, I don't know. When's your wife going to get cancer? And he was like, oh my God, Kysa, like, how could you ask that? And I was like, I'm not being rude. I'm just saying it's the same unknown.
So when you met David, you had your first date. He made it clear. He was very honest about his MS, which I think is commendable. You almost blew it off because it didn't seem like a big deal. So as you got closer to getting married, did MS factor into your decision at all in terms of thinking about the future?
I was pregnant before we got married. So I knew that part of him was, functioning great. And the baby was growing healthy in me. And I walked down the aisle with a little baby bump and nobody knew. But when things kind of got scary for me, it was a long time down the road. 2 summers ago, the summer the twins were born, and he had sold his company. We'd had the twins. They were in the NICU for 10 days. So that kind of raises the hair on your back. Like, are they going to be okay? Like, are they okay? Are the other kids okay? Who's taking care of them? On top of all of that, we couldn't get his medication. Like, we just, the insurance company had switched pharmacy providers, and we used to go to Walgreens and then Safeway, and we were trying to get it. I went and got it out at Target with 2 twins in the back and having to nurse and bringing a cooler, because it has to be refrigerated. This was an hour away, and an hour away with 15-day-old babies and all this. Anyway, I get it home and I give it to him, and it's in the wrong form. And I think he threw it across the room. He was so stressed out because anytime in the past, and this is before me, he had changed medications or dosages or whatever, he had a massive exacerbation. So we are at this like heightened stress level time, and we aren't even living at home because we're remodeling our kitchen.
And hold on, set the framework. How many kids do you have at this point?
6. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how long have you been married for at that point?
I'm so bad. 5 years.
Okay.
I'm so bad. I couldn't tell you how long we've been married now. It feels like 100 years.
Some
days. Yes, absolutely. But I remember giving it to him, and it was one of those moments. There's these moments of being a wife and a mom where you're like, yes, I did it. I'm so proud. I'm like, I've done one thing right. And he's just beside himself.
Because it was based in fear.
Oh, absolutely. And fear that was like, backed up by all these other issues. I remember calling David once and thinking, I wouldn't pass a DUI test right now, and I'm so sober. I haven't had a drink in 10 months,
Yeah.
Because I was so tired. And to have that on top of it, like, he can't break right now. Like, he can't.
What's so interesting about that moment is obviously the most important person on some level to keep unstressed is David, because you don't want him to have an exacerbation. But
Right.
At the same time, in light of your life together, you were experiencing something that was equally stressful and potentially arguably as bad for your health. But that moment of whether or not in that moment you had the ability to have your own frustration, or whether you had to kind of keep it together and channel it to be calmer because you're a caregiver.
Yeah.
It's confusing.
I think for me, those times bring out my monster. I don't think I've said to him before, like, I'm not great at those moments. They're so hard, and I'm so raw, and I'm so real with how I'm feeling, whether it's good, bad, ugly, indifferent, beautiful. I really, truly, I feel like, I don't know, when my mom was dying, Teddy was 2.5 months old, and she had been dying for a while, but it got really bad then. And I felt like if I don't tell everyone how I'm really, really feeling, and I'm going to blow. And I don't know what that looks like, but I just envisioned it being really bad, whatever it looked like. And so I have to be really real. I know I don't paint a pretty picture.
It's an honest one. So when you think of yourself as kind of being David's partner in crime, what would you say has been the best thing that you've done as a supportive partner in the face of his MS?
Just let him know that I'll love him no matter what happens. He's divorced, and I think, that was a really big thing. And maybe you face this too, like, who's going to love me? I'm sick.
Right.
Who's going to, and, when you're in the front facing an exacerbation, they're not pretty. Certainly one where you're paralyzed on one side, like, what does that look like sexually? What does that look like for a hug? What does that look like for holding a child or changing a diaper or helping with dinner? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think he went to that place. And I think with me, it took him a long time to trust that, like, if he does get sick, I will be there. I might not be pretty through it. I'm pretty confident I won't be. I'll probably need a lot of help and counseling. And, that's why we're having this conversation. Like, what's it look like for a spouse, right?
Yeah. In light of what I've learned about you, Kysa, in terms of your new book, The No Bullshit Guide to Parenting, and this whole thing of accountability for your kids and organization, how you can organize yourself to live your life, that you spend a lot of time doing a magnificent job organizing in really smart ways for your family, but this is something you can't organize. And I wonder if that's something that you've thought about.
Yeah. I mean, I do really well when we are kind of pretty organized, on path. If something gets messy, it's like, well, everything else is kind of organized and I know where we're going or what we're doing or da 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 da. And when you don't have an answer or you don't have a solution, like we didn't with that MS, I think the unknown is absolutely terrifying for all of us, no matter what it is.
Yeah. David has definitely made time to work with the National MS Society and be involved in the MS world. What would you say has inspired you most about that world of MS?
I've worked on our gala here in Portland a lot. And my biggest thing is, how can we get the guests to see and feel and touch and hear and understand what it's like to have MS? That's always my thing. Every year, they're so tired of hearing it because there's these things that you can do. You can scratch up the lens of goggles and then put those on and walk around with flippers, like swimming flippers on. And that's what some people with MS feel like. Or you put on gloves, like big, huge gloves, and try and pick up a pen.
Mm.
And so, I like to pull at the heartstrings in that way, not necessarily for donations, but this is what these people feel. I'd like my kids to see, we do the MS walk every year, like what they see, what other people feel like, what their lives are like. Like, that's my biggest thing, like to get in and get in their shoes and feel it. And you can't, you just can't, but to get as close as they can. That's been it for me. And then, obviously raising money so there's more support out there for people with MS, like, what you're doing too.
Yep. Right. And I think support comes in many forms. What do you feel like you're the most proud of about David in light of his MS?
God, Kate, that's a good question. He, you described him really well. He's so resilient. And he's such a fighter for whatever he's going after. But I think the biggest thing, he's been successful and he's done all these things. He's a great dad. He's a great husband. He is a real big supporter of people. He really is. He really is one of the best cheerleaders I've ever met in my life. He's helped so many people launch their lives, whatever it's in their job or being a father or teen parent, or even our children, go after what they want. I would have to say that is his strongest suit, is to really go after and help people being their cheerleader and helping them find their path. And maybe you'd agree.
Yeah, I would. What's been so great about my relationship with your husband is certainly getting to check in with him, and, had a number of occasions recently of talking about my counterpain, which is something that I'm pursuing, and having his wholehearted response and coming up with ideas. And, I think there's this underlying, it sounds saccharine, and I think you've done a great job in this podcast really demonstrating a lonely moment that isn't sexy or beautiful at all, that's urgent and chaotic and not fun. But meeting people who are dealing with it and being in this MS world is, you do end up having a level, I think, of being present and compassionate to others that is just expands your world in a really wonderful way. And I've seen it with David because we've had such great conversations, and he remains a total badass.
I know.
He's on an airplane all the time with his job. He's got 6 kids. He still is an incredible athlete. And I just think that that's awesome. So any last advice that you would give to the caregivers who are listening out there?
I just think it's hard. And my advice would be to you have to take care of your loved ones, whether it's kids, parents, your spouse or partner who's sick. But I definitely think to take care of yourself is almost sometimes more important, and don't feel guilty about it. There are times where I have to ask David for help, and I need it. Like, I need help too,
Right.
And that honesty really doesn't look pretty all the time, which I've mentioned a couple times, but it really does fill my cup to get the help that I also need. I'm not sick, but I do have needs. and
Love
I'm
it.
not afraid to ask. And I didn't get here overnight. I really did not. Wow.
But you're still here, and that's the best
I'm
part of
still
that
here.
story, even with gray hair and a terrible haircut.
It's bad. It is bad.
Kysa, you're amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Kate. This was really fun. I really appreciate the time.
If you're a caregiver listening to this podcast, what piece of advice would you give other caregivers? And if you're a patient listening to this podcast, what is something that your caregiver does really well? We look forward to hearing what you've got on mycounterpain.com/Moodify.